of the things I read a little bit about was the book Fluke, but I also read, you had sent me an article in Palladium entitled "My Last 5 Years of Work." It was really interesting. It was
Yeah,
it was really good. What?
crazy. She's
Go ahead.
25. Can you believe that? She's 25. She put that out.
Amazing.
I mean, she's
Amazing.
also, according to some of the stuff I saw, she's also, now to give her credit where credit is due, extremely intelligent, Rhodes Scholar, chief of staff for the CEO of Anthropic. So I mean, she's in the article itself. The title's
Avital
catchy.
Balwit, that's her name.
Yeah, it's Avital Balwit, I think. I don't know if I apologize to anybody if I'm butchering the name, but it's amazingly well written. I am kind of curious, and I heard another podcaster say this as well. Curious if she actually used the Claude 3 model to help her write it, which would be kind of cool. But the first couple of paragraphs, I think, they're catchy. They catch kind of into that current hype cycle, but they raise some really good points. The one that stuck out to me was this quote that says, "The general reaction to language models among knowledge workers is one of denial. They grasp at the ever diminishing number of places where such models still struggle, rather than noticing the ever growing range of tasks where they have reached or passed human level." And I think it's a very almost poetic and very succinct way of kind of hitting some of the things that you and I are spending so much time talking about.
Yeah, it's funny because my first thought, and this is super selfish, is, oh, it's validating an idea I have that
we're not alone.
This article because it's validating ideas. But like, I feel like it's interesting because she placed it here onto AI, but I also see that that's like going on in the corporate world right now, right? Like, after the pandemic, things have shifted, people have shifted, and yet we're still kind of thinking about the same thing, but there's a really strong sense of denial. Like, let's not talk about it and we'll just pretend it's not there. Like, I'm so surprised that, in this article, she brings up the effects of unemployment on the workforce. Yep. And here in the United States, anyways, I'm just surprised that there's not more people talking about, right? Like, what can people do who are unemployed, and how can we actually use this to the benefit so people still feel like they have purpose and understand
getting unemployed
or keep from getting unemployed, right? Exactly. But there's kind of this great opportunity, just like, the pandemic was. We had this whole reset, and there's this great opportunity we have. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it feels like we have this great opportunity. But somewhere in our society of our human nature, denial is still there. Like,
why do you think? Because we run into it all the time, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I know in the conversations that I'm having, sometimes it's denial, sometimes it's just lack of awareness. Okay, I get it. Maybe you're not following, you're not living in the rabbit hole like maybe you and I are. But where do you think the denial comes from? Is it fear?
That's kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, it feels like. So let me give another example. I don't know. I guess fear does feel right, because like, I think about like all the political divide that's going on all over the world right now too, right? There's really, really strong judgment, but there's this like big human being denial too, of like, wait, we just don't have to buy into those systems anymore. So there's another example of denial. And I can't help but think that it goes to fear of like, I have to just worry about myself because all this bad stuff is going on, which is very fear-based, right? When you're coming from a loving place, you're just connected to the greater good. And when you're connected to the greater good, you want to do more for other people, which in turn, right, does reward you too. And that's everybody, by the way. That's not just me. We're literally wired for that. But I don't know. I don't know. It's just so weird. The denial is like so big. Everybody sees it in so many different ways. But it feels like we're running this pattern of, well, if we don't talk about it, it's not there. And as human beings.
So that goes back to like you and I were talking about, like, I think I used like the head in the sand kind of. I mentioned that at one point when you and I were talking, and part of it, like, I think you have to take it outside of AI, right? Like, there's a lot of other things I think that are playing into it. So you have kind of natural skepticism on some of the news agencies that are out there, and natural skepticism of the information that we're being exposed to. I think there may be a natural distrust of technology, or we're getting so close to the sci-fi reality of AGI that you have a potentially sentient technology, and that's a lot to wrap your head around. There's a lot of
You mean like
philosophical stuff.
technology that understands and is aware of things going on around it, so it can incorporate those learnings
Yeah,
into its model life.
true artificial general intelligence, self-aware, like the movie, the one that people talk about a lot. Did you ever see the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix? Yeah,
Mhm.
so like that, not to bring up the whole Scarlett Johansson voice issue OpenAI had. I wasn't going there. But like
Snap it.
yeah, but that kind of technology, it becomes pivotal in human history, and that's a lot to wrap your head around. But then you also have, on top of that, you combine all that together, the potential personal impact that it can have on the real displacement of things. Like, there's a huge amount of opportunity, but then there's also this, it's almost human nature to kind of look at the negative first, or at least in my experience, a lot of people go there first instead of really looking conversely, well, what is the opportunity? Not that I think we'll ever get to like there was a Star Trek episode, I think, where they found a utopian society where no one worked and everybody had the chance to enhance their better selves. And I don't know, that to me feels a little too woohoo
That sounds actually like a lot of hard work too. Like, we actually like work as human beings. So fulfilling our purposes and feeling like we're contributing is
Yep.
actually, it's just a matter of, right, what we each personally want. But I do think that you're talking about something there. Like you said, oh, we go into fear first, which is, that's like the first emotion you feel as a human being. Like, as a tiny little baby, it's all about survival. But somehow it feels like we're really stuck there. Like, we are like, oh, this stuff is going on, this stuff is going on. And we have these like
Yep.
invisible boundaries. And this is in AI, this is in society, this is in the workplace. It feels like we have these invisible boundaries that we're holding on ourselves, and we have to only stay in judgment and fear because that feeling is so strong, like something's wrong right now, but we're playing there. And I can't help but wonder, like, if this is the super, super serious stuff that we can't leave from, like, it feels kind of miserable, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it can. I mean, think about,
we're not at war. Yes, we're leading to it, but all of we're not at war all over, a global war. But the feeling that people have is right. Like, it could be leading to it if we only put our attention into war. And so it just makes me curious, as people, like, why do we put these boundaries that, make us feel like we're being chased by a dinosaur and about to be eaten tomorrow, right? Instead of like, holy cow, we have great technology. We have a whole world who's looking for change, right? We got a global reset. That's amazing. And, what can we do to lessen some of those barriers? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
yeah. I mean, but, and then think about, it's part of it, I think, goes to that, just curiosity. We talk about curiosity a lot. Like, you and I are both extremely curious about a bunch of different things. And then you look at the interplay, right? The interplay of it. So there's that, everybody likes to say garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data, right? Especially even some of them, people will use that when you're talking about some of the frontier models and the AI stuff is, it's all about the data that goes in and the data that comes out. Well, the same is true for us. So like, I know I noticed during the pandemic, and it's kind of held true, that if I watch too much of the news, or I go too far down the rabbit hole into the articles that talk about the negative aspects of it, it affects my mental health. It affects my perspective on the world. And I think that may be this AI opportunity and the awesomeness that is the potential for what it could be, sometimes bats up against the fact that, depending on where you're getting your information, or how much of it you consume, maybe nobody wants to take that next step. And it's easier to think about the negative ramifications. Like perfect example, the recent Joe Rogan podcast that had Jeremy and Edward Harris on it. They founded Gladstone AI, and they did an investigation. And that whole episode, if you listen to it, it's a long one, almost 3 hours. You can see Rogan like saying to them, "You're not making me feel better. You're not making me feel better." But they aren't presenting anything in a what I would consider overly negative light. What they're doing is just highlighting the real risk there. I mean, because there is, with any opportunity, there's always risk. So now I've got to wrap my head around that while I'm also dealing with a whole bunch of, let's say, not sunshiny kind of information and data sets that I'm getting from my news outlets or my social media feeds or whatever. Maybe it causes people to shut down a little bit, to not really want to do the mental masturbation of what's possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good, really good thought about it, because that could be where people are at, is they're just like, this feels heavy, this feels hard. And the more I look into it, I'm seeing more things that are validating this negative feeling I'm having. But you know me, I'm the ever optimist. It feels like there's an opportunity here, right? Like, you don't have to go into, start reading the philosophers and things like that to feel better, right? Like that internal war, that inner dialogue that we're having. Like you said, you found a way, watching less news, not going as deep into something, and looking more holistically. Like, that was a way for you to be like, wait a minute, I have some choice and control over what I'm consuming, over what I'm doing. And you know what? That feels better for me. But you being aware of that, right? Like, that's a powerful tool of saying like, hey, it actually is better, and it is actually less work for me not to have to carry this low vibe, negative, way down deep type of thinking that we're as humans, right? We are problem solving beings. We're always looking for, little fun problems to solve, but we can get caught in loops, right? Where we're like, sometimes the loops are like this, sometimes they're like that, sometimes they're all over, but you know what I mean? We all have those patterns that we create. I don't know. They start to run our lives in more ways because they become automatic. And so
or I go back to the patterns, right? Like, so for me, I know when something is uncomfortable, or it's touching that fear response, or let's not even say fear, let's just say uncomfortable. My natural inclination is to force myself to better understand it. Not only understand whatever that it is, let's say in this case AI, but also understand how I'm reacting. Like, how is it showing up in me? How's it showing up in my body, in my mental health, in the things that I may or may not be doing, right? And I dive in. Some people don't have that same approach. For some of them, there has to be a threshold. Like, I think it was in the Rogan podcast where somebody says, they're talking to somebody about AI who doesn't live in AI. And this person says to them, hey, I'll worry about it when it can do X, whatever that X is. And the guys say, well, it can do that. But then that person still doesn't take the next step into exploring it. So I don't know that I understand the resistance to it, or where it comes from, other than increasing your self-awareness or how you handle that. Like, if you think about everything that's going on in business, like if we take it back to business, and the Klarna CEO, and I'm probably not going to get his name correct, Sebastian Siemiatkowski, I think, put up some tweet about how much they were saving as a result of using Gen AI on X or Twitter, whatever we're calling it these days. And there was a bit of outrage over it, but I can understand that. Wait,
what was the outrage over?
He basically was saying that, they're saving tens of millions of dollars on the marketing side, by reducing the reliance on outside agencies, or reducing team size. And I think it might have been an article that was in FinTech Magazine. The CMO was, I think, talking about the fact that they haven't been hiring. They're actually shrinking through natural attrition. They haven't done that, but just natural attrition, and they're still growing. And that's really kind of what we're looking at, is like, how do you in those roles that are easily automatable, how do
Mhm.
you find a way to stay relevant, to stay impactful, to not just use the tech? I mean, everybody's going to have to be using the tech. Everybody is going to at some point be touched by or need to understand it. I shouldn't say everybody. Like I said, my therapist doesn't like absolutes. So most people, we'll say most people, but it's going to touch a lot of people. So you're going to need to know how to use the tools to some extent. But I mean, going beyond that, like how do you up level to not only use the tools, but increase those skill sets that the AI is not going to be able to as readily replace? And I think that's a big jump for a lot of people.
I mean, there's no question, right? We are at a point of change in history. And in one way, I can completely understand people's hesitancy of, I'm not going to get the technology, because we said that when the internet came out, when for 2 years, 2 to 5 years, people had business models based on we're a .com, right? We're literally a web address, but we
Yep.
were all learning. And we didn't know that then, right? We didn't know really that's all it was, that there was so much more to it. And then I think, the iPhone came in, and then portals, and then interconnectivity. And like, I think there's been, from a lot of leaders, there's been, you're going to have to know this technology. So they spent time to really learn how the tech is built to try to get to that thinking. But I think we're here. I think the promise of technology from, 40, 50 years ago in the 70s, that was an idea, like, it's here. But this time, you don't, as like, especially as a business leader, you don't have to actually understand how the technology works. But because we're there, where we can automate hard tasks, where we can reduce the time spent on iterations, like you talked about agencies, right? Like, because we're there, like, there's no question new thinking is needed. Like, there's no question. Um,
And that becomes a divide too, right? Like you and
yeah.
I mean, we've worked in agencies, we worked together in agencies. There was a difference between clients that we worked with or individuals that we worked with that had that ability to take the next jump, to be able to see, see into the future a little bit, or apply the creativity or posit and brainstorm things back and forth. And there were some that mode of interaction or that mode of thinking didn't work for. And so I'm curious if that becomes, it's going to be interesting to see if that becomes kind of one of the bellwethers, the measures, the things that will help keep people relevant, is up leveling the own application of things that we haven't seen a lot of in places like critical thinking, or that creativity and the self-awareness. Does it create a new subset of what it means to be a productive member of society? I think Elon Musk, there was a bunch of stuff going on with Elon Musk saying that AI was going to remove the need to work, that work was going to be optional in the future. And it gets pretty philosophical when you get into removing that. Like a lot of human beings, as Avital Balwit pointed out in that article, they get their sense of self from the work that they do. And so if that does go away, or it becomes optional, what kind of impacts could that have? And that can lead you down a questionable thought process.
I
Right?
feel like I'm, of course, hearing like amazing opportunities. But so I don't know exactly what you're talking about with Elon Musk, but I actually agree with that. Like, I think that we're at a place in time where, like, or I guess I should say this, are we at a place in time where we've been so logical and analytical that we've forgotten about the humanness, and maybe work as we know it today is going away? Human beings like play and work, like they like to feel like they're moving towards their goal. So I don't think that will ever go away. In that article Chad referenced too, there's talks about people who are retired and how their mental health is so much happier because they're just putting their efforts into making their life work the way they want. And I think that's where I see with AI the opportunity is that, and I guess the question would be, is there new roles emerging here, right? Like the business leader who understands that you do need to be a change agent, that we are in the midst of change. It doesn't have to be everybody, but we do need some creative thinker, business, leaders who are courageous enough to say, you know what? stuff isn't working the way I'd like it to. How can I make it better in whatever circumstances you are today for myself and for my team and for my culture? Right. And that's where I agree with Elon saying that eventually work could go away, because it could not feel like work. It could just be like, we're working towards a greater purpose to, Elon's is, interplanetary habitation, right? He wants to live on Mars, right? But, yours
Let's
could,
not set the bar
mine
too
could
high.
be like thinking about thinking, right? Like that's what I love. I love the human brain. Others could be curing cancer. It could be like whatever you want, to where it's actually not like work today. So that type of work could go away.
And I could see that. I mean, my wonder, as you talk about that, made me think maybe there's a lot of philosophical things that this brings up, right? Like when you start talking about, I mean, we've got generative AI now, and you talk about, achieving AGI, truly sentient, machines. Like there's a lot of societal things that come into play there. A lot of people talk about universal basic income. But you have societal things that come into play, the access to the technology, the democratization of it. Like there's a lot. Like it gets heavy, no doubt it gets heavy. And I'm wondering if some people just, they feel the first pebble hit the pond, and that first ripple is, well, how is it going to affect me? First, should I care about how it's going to affect me? But you get out into that next ripple, and a lot of people that we talk to, at least that I've been having conversations with, well, how's it going to affect me financially? Because we are equating that financial stability with success or safety or whatever it may be. But the next ripple out is, how does it impact my community, my team inside of a business? Does it change the structure of how the team operates? Does it change the business model for the entity I work for? Does it require more from me, a different piece of me, less from me? Then you even go out another ripple and you get into the societal stuff. So when you start to see those ripples go out and how it's going to affect things, I can see it being a pretty heavy topic for people that go that far with it. And maybe there's just reluctance to even go that far because they can't even understand what it may mean for them as an individual. Is that making sense?
That is making sense. And that for me really feels like, wow, what a great opportunity. To help people see how it will affect them, but it doesn't have to be scary or happen to them. Something else, even when you brought up your examples, that was rattling around my head, is that as a society, we really are under the assumption and operate like everything has a right equation, that there's, a linear way, that there's something that I just have to figure out what the answer is. And I kind of feel like this in AI, to get into some tech philosophy here, I think that this is actually getting into what are the questions, right? Like flipping that mindset from what does it mean for me into what can I do with it to benefit the world the way I want to.
How do you think that's going to go? How do you think that'll really go? Like because like some people will talk about the me culture, or the social media filter where everybody puts the glorious parts of their lives out, or that concept of like a digital profile isn't necessarily who I am as a human, and it's all me, look at me, look at me, look at this. I mean, we're even engaging in some of that by doing this. Do you think that's going to get in the way of that mindset you just mentioned of, hey, what can I do for others? Think that's
Yeah,
gonna
of
be a
course,
challenge for
of course, of
people?
course, of course, because we're survival beings, right? We are adaptation machines, right? Our brains have histories back to 300 million years ago, right? So survival's first. But I wonder if there is a way to gain excitement or to take people through, right? The joy and the pleasure that comes from practicing different skills that can lead you out of fear. Like you mentioned it when you were in the pandemic and stopping watching the news, right? Like I did that. I got really back into gardening, right? I think I created a garden on every square inch of soil that I have around my house. I'm a grower, Chad. I like to plant seeds and watch it grow. Um, but I think that, how do we see it going? I think it sounds hard to just say like, oh, we're going to flip a company culture tomorrow, or this is where the way of working is going to be different. Like the hierarchy isn't needed anymore. What's needed instead is better improved communication to get themes in pivotal decisions, would get that information disseminated easier. But I also think that a really simple way to do that is by looking internal, right? Like if you start to just see that you're a being of energy, right? Every time you and I are interacting, we're exchanging energy and we're becoming entwined some ways. And that happens with every person we see out in our lives, whether it's the mailman, whether it's at the grocery store, right? All that stuff that COVID made it really clear for all of us that when that's cut off, we kind of feel a part of ourselves is missing, right? I mean, we all got to experiment with that. Some people, they may not have felt any missing, and that's great. But for those who really do, right, we're beings who are wired to connect. There's this opportunity to understand that energy and not make it have to be so big and worldwide, and instead say, can I make some small changes within me to shift the energy that I'm now putting out to you, Chad, right? Like, can I get clear with and heal some of my own, not traumas from the past, or traumas from the past, but, puzzles that I've created, by the way, most of them for myself, to deal with situations that happened along the way. I think that to me is where the how is going to happen is when we accept that we have some control over it, that it doesn't have to be heavy and weighty. I know words you kept using, but that it can actually be really tiny, simple moments of reprieve that we're giving ourselves internally.
That's going to require a level of self-awareness, self-honesty, that if I'm being completely candid and authentic, I don't know that I achieved until my 40s, and not even in the middle, right? Like that's for some people can be an extremely challenging, even almost painful in some senses, journey that they have to go through. And now in order to stay relevant in business, to become more human, kind of our focus and what we've been talking about, is going to require it's going to require some pretty significant global therapy.
Well, so can I throw something back at you and say,
Sure.
What if the Gen Z and millennials actually already get it? What if it took us because of, hold on, let me finish. Put your judgment away, sir. What if we had learned, Gen Xers had learned along, I'm going to just reference my generation, right? What if we had learned going into the system that we knew there was kind of a lot of BS, right? And some boomers and those people too, right? Because nobody is absolute. No generation's absolute. And we said, okay, this is the production line, right? That like Henry Ford got going, was this is how you go to work and you just do this and you don't even have to think anymore. Like that was creative and a reprieve back in the day. But by the time we got into the workforce, 28 years ago, almost 30 years ago, maybe for me anyways, what if we saw holes and we started teaching kids that, right? We started teaching other people. We started learning that. We started talking about our feelings. Now, you and I went through therapy and group sessions and design thinking, and it took us a while to get there. And our age is also beautiful because it's a transformative time in life anyways. But what if we had taught kids, the Gen Z and millennials, what if we have already taught them how to communicate their feelings? And then the only thing they've ever been presented with is this old-fashioned workforce, right? That is hierarchy-based, that says no, emotions and communications and your value isn't valued there. So to bring it all back around, it's like, would it be as hard as we actually thought it would? Or are we spending more time and effort trying to keep a system alive that isn't working? It doesn't mean it's crumbling, but it means something has to change. So that's where my head goes.
So there's a lot there, right? There's a lot there. So on one hand, you're talking about organizational structures as they exist today, coming from previous generations. Totally understand. I'm with you 100%. I'm skeptical Gen X to the core. We saw holes, and I don't think they will necessarily survive as they are today. Right? I'm 100% with you. I think they have to change. The other piece of that, though, is that in order for the change to happen, there has to be an understanding, a recognized understanding that it doesn't just happen because I'm of a different generation, first and foremost. And second, I think we have to be really careful, and this goes for everybody, that I don't know that anybody got it right. I don't know that anybody has it right. So like that word to me, like, you know, when you said like maybe Gen X, Gen Z got it right or getting it right, they're different. It's a different approach. Things will have to change. But I think right, just as much as the word wrong, is a judgment call in a lot of cases. Right. So for me, it's the underlying, what's the value, the values, the character of individuals. I don't care what generation you're in. I believe wholeheartedly that you have to understand that there is a need for work. Now, I don't necessarily mean business, but I'm talking about the application of energy towards change.
Yeah.
That has to be
that.
chosen. And it's not easy all the time. It's going to be hard. And what I struggle with is the sense of entitlement and the way that it is communicated, regardless of generation. Anybody that thinks they're entitled to something, the list of what you are entitled to, in my view, is very small, right? Depending on, and it changes depending on what country you're in, what your government maybe like that changes. I believe everybody's entitled to be respected, regardless of where they're from. No factor. I believe every human being is deserving of respect. I believe one of the best ways to get along in business or in your community or your friend group is to also protect your boundaries for that respect. So that requires effective emotional communication to not protect those boundaries in a way that creates the perception of need for an aggressive response.
Right. Or creates more boundaries by you trying to protect your boundaries, because that doesn't end up
boundary after boundary
right? Right. Like your boundaries cause somebody else to build boundaries. And that's
Right.
that's exactly what I'm saying. I like that thinking. And I'm not going to say you're right, but I wanted to. I guess
No,
the generational,
I may not be right.
I think there's something here of it's not only about noticing that something has to change. The
Right.
world is full of people who are criticizing it's not working. But in order for change to happen, we each individually need to choose, and we need to choose on a regular basis that we understand change is happening and we're going to embrace it so we can better align with the change that's happening rather than resist it. So I guess to get back to your thinking is working on micro moments of choice and change and autonomy, right? If you think of ourselves as human beings, that feels really good to me to be like, I am in control of my life. So how do I create more opportunities for choice as a business leader so that I can actually start to find more opportunities to affect the energy that I'm putting out there and affect the energy that is being thrown at me at all times?
And yeah, and I think there's also a need to understand the role that ego plays in it, right? There's this natural, kind of go back to the reptilian brain, right? Fight or flight or whatever we're calling those these days. There is a sense of, I have to protect myself. I think that's natural for people. I'm wondering if, let's say we achieve AGI in the next 4 years, as they're kind of predicting, just take that off the table for a second. Like, everybody's focused on that. Let's just look at the Gen AI stuff right now, the generative AI, and the changes that it's making. I think in order, one of the pieces to stay relevant is I don't want to use the word sacrifice. Let's say the better modulation of the sense of self in the larger collective, in the larger, like, we have to, I think we probably should stop being as married to our own perception of what we should be, and make a better effort to understand what we are in a larger group. So that shift from perception, my self-perception, to perspective of a larger whole. I think social
So
media, like people talk about it all, putting people in, everybody has their own reality, and we could get into the neuroscience of whether or not that's true. But at the end of the day, I think we all have a tendency with the things that we interface with to create our own little worlds. And I think in order for us to effectively seize the opportunities before us, it's going to require understanding that interconnectedness at a different level. Am I even close to making sense? I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
you are rambling, but it's actually very beautiful. I like it. I like the rambling because you're really bringing up the fact that, one, we all have egos, and our egos are not us. Our egos are our super powerful, our superpower ways that we know are proven patterns of running. And that's why each person's pattern is different, right? What you consider a reward might be, right, a trigger for me for get the heck out of here. But I think that really brings up of the thinking that ego is just a pattern that's run. It's a really well-worn pattern, but it's not actually like you or your essence. And so by recognizing, one, what is your ego? And can you get curious about how did I find that, right? And can you get a breath or a space in between your essence and your ego? That's a pretty cool opportunity for leaders to look at, right? Like starting to see yourself from a little bit of that outsider perspective. Funny enough, by looking inward, right? I think that gives us an opportunity, and that's great because we all play roles, right? Like I'm a mom, I'm a volunteer, I'm a gardener, I'm a technologist, I'm a philosopher, I'm a hippie dancing fool, right? I love music. Like I'm all these things that have different roles anyways. But I can look at most of those roles and say, well, that's a sector of me. But for some reason, when it comes to my ego, it feels like it's so much more complicated and complex and complete me. And I have to often practice and catch myself saying, that's my ego running this. It's not actually bringing me the rewards that I want out of the situation.
Well, and go back to and we've seen this play out multiple times, even, back when we were working together, we've seen it play out. Think about it the way that it manifests in business, right? And when that ego, whatever that is, whatever that, the way it presents in a business environment, it often can create friction, right? It leads to that creation of what type of culture does an organization have. And with all of the people that I've trained and all the people that I've worked with in the last, let's just say 5 years, the one constant is everybody telling me that they are too busy. They're too busy. There's too much going on for them to do X, which they know X is going to help them be better. But I'm too busy with this other stuff to do this thing, whatever it may be, implement the training that I just received or whatever it is. Or I feel overwhelmed, right? The sense
Too
of
busy
anxiety.
to say, hey, I don't need to attend this meeting.
Right.
Their
Yeah.
ego makes them go to it to be like, oh, I don't know why I'm going here, but I'm not going to ask it. So I'm going to show up anyways.
Yeah. Right. And so as a result of that, I think there's a big opportunity with this. I think of it as a very large change, very cataclysmic change, not cataclysmic. It's a negative. Let's say the birth of this opportunity.
Ooh, I like that. Birth is hard. I like that.
With the birth of this opportunity isn't going to be easy for companies to integrate, for individuals to, let's say, companies to integrate, teams to work with, or individuals to harness. And it's going to require work. So to go back to what we were talking about with the generational stuff, yes, communication for honest emotional communication for, say, Gen Z seems, based on my experience, and it is limited, so I don't know that I have a complete data set to make a true opinion on that. But in my perspective, it is more honest in some cases, their own honesty. But there also needs to be the effort put in to understand the world in which they are expressing that honesty, and how it may be taken, not as a judgment, but just understanding the receiver of that communication has their own shit going on, and they, they're going to take it based from their perspective. So it's everybody expecting me to be the center of attention, rather than understanding you don't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah. Like you're part of something bigger. Like you mentioned the ripples earlier, right? Like no doubt about it. We are machines that will make sure we're protecting ourselves. But the funniest thing is I think that it actually doesn't take more work when you start looking at the bigger perspective. I feel like it actually takes a lot of pressure off of yourself, right? Like when you're looking at, when you start taking some personal accountability and you just get curious, no judgments, right? Like, why do I do that? Or why does that person always do that? And you start getting curious about it. You can see, right, that it may not be, let me say, as negative or offensive if you think about the context why.
Right.
But the first thing you have to do is get curious and not let your ego say, I know that person. I've seen that person before. My ego has dealt with that. So therefore I'm going to just go and, assume that was bad intentions. But that does take personal accountability to say, I have the power within me. And that's any generation, like you said, to say, I have the power within me to understand that, this older person's context and view of the world is different than mine. Let me just be aware of how my communication affects them. And then the same way, older to younger generations to be able to say, I get that while they may not know all the details of what I'm trying to say, they may actually be onto something. And maybe I should get curious about what it is that, they're really trying to get to, because there is something of a piece of conflict here, or a piece of something that comes up that's just not flowing freely. And it does take some vulnerability, but it's also kind of cool if you think about it. Like you can start being more, giving yourself mental breaks by getting curious about what others are doing, and whether that's what they're thinking, or just curious about how you're affecting somebody else's. Just observe a situation of how are you affecting somebody else's energy.
Well, and it's that for me, it was always the stars, right? Like whenever I would get so wrapped up in whatever was going on with me, and it felt overwhelming, and it felt difficult, challenging, whatever it may be. For me, that's what drove me to stargazing, was like, okay, if I'm looking up and I'm starting to truly contemplate all of the stars and all of the space and all of the things out there, and you zoom out, then the fact that somebody didn't say yes to an idea, or the fact that, somebody chose to say something that I didn't respond well to, minuscule, very, very not important. So it's that, for me, it's that importance of perspective for the individuals. And this goes beyond kind of the generational divides. This may just be how do you reach understanding. Like everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, back to my therapist, no absolutes. A lot of people have a tendency to take things really personal. Like they take it, and sometimes you need to. I'm not saying that there isn't a reason to do that, but I feel like everybody takes everything way too personal these days, rather than from a place of contemplative understanding. Like, okay, why is that person saying that way? And why am I having the reaction I'm having? And thinking before we speak, right? And I think in business, that's going to become even more critical. Honesty's important. Contemplation is also critical. And contemplation beyond oneself in that business environment is also critical, I think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But you can't.
That feels right. That really, again, no, absolutely. That feels good. That feels good. That the importance of taking a breath and seeing it, I can relate to what you were saying about the stargazing too. I look at the trees. I love being in like wild grasses and trees and the mountains, and watching how, when you're sitting in the middle of a forest and you start seeing the language of the trees work together, you start noticing the breeze and how they're all feeling it and how it's moving along. And it takes me out of myself, out of here, right?
Yeah.
Into up here. And it does give you space and perspective that you hadn't had before. But then it goes to, but then I ask, what comes up for me is the internal stress, right? This, that is always going on. Like, I don't have time to look up. I don't have time to go for a hike, even though I'm dealing with all this stuff in my head, when in reality, it's exactly what I need to release some stuff and give room for other things, or let other things come in, so you know what stuff isn't important anymore.
But it gets to a point of like personal awareness and personal responsibility. Like, it's to be self-aware. Let's back up. So let's say if I want to activate my choice, my power of choice, and I want to activate it in a way that is positive for my team, if I'm in business, for the division, the organization, whatever, or positive for my community or the things that I'm in, then I have to take on the responsibility that power of choice gives me. And I don't think a lot of people, in my experience, really take a breath. I mean, I love that phrase. I mean, I used to hate that phrase because it was always like, when I'd be, pissed off as a kid, that was always one of the first things my parents said, take a breath, right? Like, but in practice, as I've gotten older, my experience has shown me that if I can just take a breath, take a second, think about what I'm hearing instead of just responding. Because like for a long time, and you saw this when we worked together, for a long time for me, there was no filter. There was no filter. If I thought it was coming out of my face. That was not always an awesome thing.
There were some really funny times though that it was awesome.
There were, but that is sometimes okay. The situation calls for it, right? Like I had a linguistics professor in college that said, sometimes I ain't got none is perfectly appropriate. Right. And so you have to have a bigger awareness. And so I don't know how in business you bring in the Gen AI and you think about all the changes that could be happening. There is personal responsibility that you have to accept if you want to activate effectively your power of choice to determine the direction you're going to move as these changes happen. Does that make sense?
It does. And my head naturally goes to like, what's happening inside that could give you more power of choice. And I think about, looking at very small, minute things where you start, like, let's say the next time you go get a cup of coffee, right? You just notice, is the first thing you say to somebody like, oh, that meeting sucked. And what is their energy response back to you?
Yeah.
Versus, oh my God, it's a beautiful sunshiny day. I'm breathing, like, how's your day going? Like, right. Like what, just that tiny little bit of change, like how much it can affect you. And then also I go to our inner wiring of, we're wired for reward. So if somebody's giving off a better energy, what we're going to do is actually try to figure out how we can become more connected to them, versus if somebody's giving off negative energy, we're naturally just going to stay away from them. So like your parents said, right, that taking a breath actually connects your left and right brain thinking, and the physical act of connecting with your body to your mind, while it is just a breath, it's actually so physically important for your body, for your mind to connect with your body to say, is this a real stress, or is this something that it's just my thoughts are making it stressful?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you bring it all the way kind of back, like there is a bigger challenge. Like, so when we talk about why aren't more people really leaning into and understanding what Gen AI could mean? And again, I go back to, nobody has all the answers. Things are moving and changing so fast that the joke I heard on one podcast was, I don't want to say, well, a month ago, and like I'm referring to ancient history, but in the speed of which things are changing, a month ago is ancient history. So now tie into that when we think about why are they resistant to really understanding what it means and doing the work, engaging mentally and intellectually in the way they need to harness the change. Put on top of that the speed at which the information we consume comes in, social media, text messages, emails, phone calls. I'm just talking digital at that point. I'm not even talking about dealing with, say, like contractors or other people, right? All the information we're taking in creates that sense of speed that's overwhelming, that a lot of people in business have told me makes them feel overwhelmed. And in response, they don't have the time to do something. They've made a choice to prioritize something else. That's a not awesome perspective for some people. That's really tough for them to admit, hey, I didn't do that because I chose to do something else. And that requires them to take a stance, but also potentially communicate to somebody else that, hey, I thought that other stuff wasn't as important. And the stuff you want me to be doing is kind of BS. Like, there's a responsibility that comes with that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there is. There like some more honest conversation of yourself, of why you did or didn't. And then as leaders too, don't forget, like embracing this change means we actually also have to help our team members negotiate loss, right? Like as you're saying, more things are going on. I watched a couple of my teams over the last couple of years just focus on prioritizations, which I think is actually incredible. But what was happening is prioritizations got stuck as not a point in time, and they're ever changing. And then you just kept learning new things that actually added to the steps. So what it takes is employees, us as individuals, saying, hey, okay, I think that this is where I'm seeing what's wrong. Here's what I want to work on. Here's what I'm thinking I'm going to take off. And if someone comes to me as a leader and says, this is what I think I'm going to take off, if you don't agree with it, you have to have that accountability to say, no, actually, I want you to do this. And I want you to take off. You can take off this, right? Like we have to also give room as leaders for that space to play around with being accountable and creating honest conversations, both from an employee, from a leader, right? Like we have to give that space. And I think that I think if we practiced a little bit, prioritization is great as long as we know that it's an ever-changing, ever-moving world that we're in right now. And I think one of the things that we do, especially at least here in Western society in the US, is we get attached to outcomes. We get attached to solutions of pathways, and we don't allow for change to come in and learn and then go forward.
Well, and that's, you're talking about getting comfortable. So essentially getting comfortable with change, right? So if you think about leaders and what they have to do, like the managers and the executives that I've worked with, they have to be able to essentially negotiate and communicate, negotiate not only to their teams, but into the entity, into the organization as well. And there's sometimes a reluctance to do that because maybe they don't feel as comfortable in that negotiation communication paradigm, right? But they also have to enable a cult, I don't want to say culture, a space. They have to enable a space where their team can come to them. And what I've seen happen is, like, some people will go, oh, prioritization. Like we use, I'm a big fan of the Eisenhower matrix, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Important, urgent, important, not urgent, right? So I use it a lot. But what I'll see is some leaders that we work with, when we give them that as an example, and there are others for prioritization, the prioritization becomes the roadblock they put up as a reason why. They get so caught up in the prioritization, they're not doing it quick enough or fast enough or effectively enough. And that actually eats away more of the time. So in that case, the solution itself becomes part of the problem. And
I feel like with the workplace today is so layered with those, where like I sometimes feel like, if people really, if the top like board of directors of companies really understood how much inefficiency the reports were costing, that were presented to them, they would be like, yeah, forget the reports, go spend your time on actions. Because I agree with you. I feel like there's like a Frankenstein of process, and then analysis here, and then analysis here. And while we need some people doing that, of course, you're in business to make money. We need to be risk adverse. it doesn't have to be everybody, right? Like
Right.
it doesn't have to be everybody. And instead, where we have the opportunity is to create some spaces for experimentation. And I'm not talking about doing anything different. That's another big thing I think that Chad and I are both like, it is not about adding another framework, adding another steps to your day. It's not. It's about being different. It's about how can we as leaders show up and look at areas of experimentation, right? When you ask your one of your team members a question and they give you a completely different question than you were expecting, can you give yourself 30 seconds to say, wow, I was expecting something totally different. How did you get here? And
Right.
if they don't know how they got there, then it's a great time for coaching and what you were thinking. But what if you give them space? We're talking 30 minutes to a second or to a minute where you give somebody else space to explain their thinking. And at the same time, it's creating the space that you and I were talking about to take that breath, right? Like to let our own pressure system take a breath, because that's what a question will do.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time. I've spent a lot of time over the last 8 years trying to help people understand you have to slow down to speed up. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you don't take control, like one of the phrases I always use is if you don't control your calendar, it's going to control you. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very true in your thought process, right? You have to choose what you want to engage with to achieve what is your ultimate purpose. What is it? What's your ultimate goal? What is it that you're doing? I was just talking to a client the other day, trying to give them some coaching on how to interact with an employee who was expressing severe levels of frustration, and hadn't heard any of the messaging that may have been shared with them previously on how they might address that. And I always start with, well, have you asked them what it is they're trying to accomplish? Where do they want to go? Not in business, not in work,
Yeah.
but what is their purpose? Because look, if they ever now, this is where my Gen X skepticism comes in. If they ever get around to universal income, which I find that really funny, if they ever get around to that, and you didn't have to work, some people wouldn't. Some people would still want to. So there's a reason that they're there. Could be they want to put kids through school. Could be they want to provide, benefits for their family. Whatever it is, there's some purpose, some greater purpose. So start there and then help them understand, the context that you were in 5 years ago or 3 years ago or 2 years ago when you started is not the same context you're in now, because the organization isn't the same. The entity isn't the same. The
People
technologies
aren't the
aren't the
same.
same. The
Yeah.
people aren't the same. So the context has changed. And if you're not fluid, if you're not self-aware enough to understand that, hey, it's natural for organizational context or team context to change to a point where you aren't going to get what you need out of it, and you need to make that choice to move on, or you need to make the choice to change to stay relevant if it's a company you want to be a part of. That's a choice. It's a responsibility that each individual has. And I don't think enough leaders are spending the time to work with their teams in that way, because they're so focused on dealing with, I got to get this done, the prioritization. They asked me for this report. I got to go to this meeting. Things are moving too fast. And so that concept of slow down to speed up, it's so simple, but so difficult, I think, for many people to put into play, because when you peel back the covers, there's a hell of a lot there.
There is a hell of a lot there, but like if you pull back the covers, it's like, right? Like I share this with my kids all the time. When you turn a light on in the closet, the monsters go away, right? If you shine a light on the stuff that is like causing you issues, I feel like it goes away. And I like that concept of asking people what they think. Now you don't need to do it in every meeting. I don't think you need to do it all the time, but what you need to do is make sure that you're understanding, that you feel like you have a good human to human level, that you have empathy for what that person's trying to accomplish, right? And then because by doing that, you'll actually see how that person is important or not important for you to fulfill your own desires, right? There's
Yep.
a saying in neuroscience, right? Those who wire together, or those who fire together, wire together. Meaning that when you find like-minded individuals, right? My tribe, so to speak, right? That is who it's naturally you're aligned with already. And the truth is we're not going to be aligned with everybody, But if we start getting to where each person understands a little bit more about their purpose and how they relate to the people around them, all of a sudden what we're creating is like, hey, wow, we actually, somebody wants to climb mountains on my team. Somebody else wants to travel, right? Somebody else wants to just make a lot of money so that they can give their kids whatever they want, right? Whatever your goals are, like when you start understanding that, it just becomes more harmonious. And the hippie in me is like, and happiness, people, like, let's just figure out. And then it makes it easier to understand why you may not want to work with certain people and why you may want to work with others. And I am not saying you don't work with those people. I'm just saying you give yourself a little break of why this person might be harder to work with than that person or than a different person, because your priorities just aren't aligned. And it will naturally fade out that you don't work together. That's one of the good things about being older is you see that the patterns of human behavior really do work out for what's best for you. So we don't have to feel like we're going to be trapped where we are forever.
Yeah, that was an absolutely awesome conversation.
Yes.